I'm ecstatic that it happened. And there's some things that, well, it could have been better. But I said that, and so I'm not going to crush him for this now because I said if you can get basically a bunch of expiring contracts and draft capital and nonsense and just start from scratch, do it. And that's what they're doing. The best player that they got back in the deal was Karis LeVert from the Nets, and then they turned around and traded him for Victor Oladipo, who's an expiring contract. It appears that they are planning on having lots of cap space next year, which is pretty wild when you consider they came into this year with seemingly no wiggle room for cap space at all for the foreseeable future, and they were able to make this happen. They get a bunch of draft picks, 3 unprotected firsts from the Nets, which I don't know if those are valuable or not. They're probably late first rounders. They get swap picks in 2021, 23, and 25. Those are probably picks that they won't want to swap when the time comes. Oh, and 27, pardon me. And then they get maybe the most valuable piece is Cleveland's first-round pick in 2022, which the Cavs could always just be terrible as long as LeBron James isn't there. So what you get is a bunch of basically wiggle room, and you get rid of a massive headache. And it was obvious last night on the court. It was more obvious last night at the press conference, the post-game presser, that this guy is out, and his teammates didn't want to play with him anymore. The comments that he said, DeMarcus Cousins, John Wall, both basically took it as disrespect, and the Rockets were really left with no choice. Hopefully, Deshaun Watson's not looking at this as a blueprint on how to get out of town, but if there were a blueprint made for how to get out of town, James Harden just put it out there. And, this is I warn you, the roster you will have going forward is not as talented as what you've had the last several years. This is not a contending team, period. But you've got a way to build things now around. You can find a way to build around someone that's not named James Harden, because honestly, you'd squeezed every drop of juice out of that orange that you were not going to get anymore. So they had to make something happen. I'm glad personally that they did it. I'm not interested in the Rockets yet, but I'm interested to see in how they build this thing up, and I'm hopeful that they could find a superstar eventually to build around that's not as much of a pain in the ass as this guy. Unfortunately, this is kind of the downside. They're opening up all this cap space, and they've got, the whole world's going to be their oyster next year, but it's not really a place that's going to attract free agents. And the free agent class next year, it's a little barren. So this may be a long-term rebuild. And I for one, again, I said I was willing to go through that. I was willing to sit there and watch them be irrelevant for 3 years if it meant that they eventually worked this thing back up around someone not named James Harden. So you've got yourself a new team with less of a headache, I would assume. Probably less talent, but less of a headache.
Well, I think it's clear it's a less talented team, but you'd reached your ceiling with this guy.
Absolutely.
And even his comments from last night, it's like, this isn't working. It's like, yeah, you know why it's not working? It's because of you. You're the problem. And, yeah, you're going to have to take a step back here because you weren't going to get a player as good as James Harden back. But you might get somebody – well, and with Oladipo, you got a pretty good player. I mean, I don't think he's clearly not James Harden, but he doesn't suck.
Well, but he's also an expiring contract, so he's not here for the long haul, presumably.
Presumably, who knows? He may get here and they may decide they want him, and if they do, and if not, you flip him at the deadline for something more long term. But one thing, I do believe the Cavs pick is actually the Bucks pick.
Oh yeah,
so
okay.
that won't
it's going to be worthless, also.
Yeah. So, but you know what? That's all right. If you have to take the step back now, you weren't going to be going anywhere with him as your best player, which I know some guy who's been saying that for years now.
Who said that?
The same guy who said the Steelers were frauds. So
God, that's a smart guy.
I hate to give you credit twice in 1 week. but I have to do it because. But you're right, and you know what? But before we start saying, "Oh well, those Nets picks aren't going to be anything," this could turn into a glorious disaster in Brooklyn.
Sure could.
I mean, that's for one thing. Durant could break at any time. Kyrie is nuts. Once they start fighting with each other, who knows how it's going to turn out there?
Yep.
Now, I think from James's perspective, that's the team that has the most talent that he wanted to go to, and I think in the East they could easily get to the finals, but it could also blow up, and I'm excited to see what happens with it. But I'm glad that the Rockets did what they did, and I'm glad that that they're moving on from him and realize, hey, you know what, we're going to hit the reset button, and I think they'll be competitive, but they're not a contender by any stretch. But at least they'll be a little more fun to watch, and I can kind of get behind the team again because I'd gotten so sick of James Harden's act because we know where it ends every year, and now we don't have to worry about that anymore, AJ.
Yep.
So
I'm personally, again, I'm not excited for the short-term future.
Right.
I think it's pretty bleak, and you have to accept that as a Rockets fan. But I'd rather have listen, the end result, if you kept Harden for the next 2 years, the end result was going to be the same as if you've got this roster now. You weren't going to win a championship, and if you're not winning a championship, who really cares? Let's face it. We've put this team to a point, and if you've got a guy like James Harden and you're not competing for a championship and you're not winning championships, what's the point of putting up with him? You know what I mean? There's at some point, and we talk about this with women, at some point there's like a hotness to how much bleep you have to put up with scale, and once that gets out of whack, like, what are you even doing? You know what I mean?
Right.
At some point, you just say, okay, this is too much. And, like, almost every hot chick has gone through that at some point. Like, when Britney Spears was shaving her head and going crazy, we were like, oh, man, she's fallen to the wrong side of that curve. Lindsay Lohan fallen to the wrong side of that curve at some point. Miley Cyrus, like, it happens, okay? James Harden's on the wrong side of the curve. Like, his pain in the ass level is far performing his talent level, his on court level. I don't need it, so I'm glad to see him go. I'm excited to see what this team can do in the future, not what they can do in the short term, but what they can do long term. And really, we have no idea. We really have no clue what they're going to do long term. But what I do know is it won't involve James Harden, so I'm probably almost going to be more interested in it by default.
And I think you're trading him at the tail end of his effectiveness anyway.
Yep.
You're talking about a guy that at some point when he slows down, it's going to go fast for him. And that's going to happen before this contract's over, which is another thing. You're out from under that. All right.